everyone. It's Sean Gibbons. Welcome back to my basement for the final day of the year, at least the final day that we're going to be together live. Everything that we've done together, as I hope you all know by now, is going to be available up on this platform where you're seeing me. A lot of it already is. So if in the next hour or two, I hope you're going to stick around for what we have just ahead. But in between, if you want to catch up on stuff or you want to come back to it over the weekend, we'd invite you to do so. We're going to leave everything up here live or on tape, I guess, right? And then we will eventually, in case you're wondering, so I've got a few questions about this, we will make everything is going to be up on YouTube so anybody and everybody can avail themselves of it. Just give us a couple weeks to make that happen, but that is our plan. I am incredibly grateful and excited to bring you all back. It would be a mistake for me to ignore what's been happening while I've been in my basement, what's been happening in our country this week. It's a lot. And I know, and hopefully you saw the email I just sent to you, one of the things that I take some hope and comfort in is the idea that this group is together and that we're all seeing what we're seeing and we're feeling what we're feeling. And we understand, and I was just saying this to all the folks who are going to be with us in a moment for the equity panel, that if you can see it and you can name it, then you can change it. And I was reminded yesterday in a conversation I had, can't remember now if it was before or after that amazing conversation with Nicole and Stacy, Dr. Jones and I were having a little chat. And he reminded me, because I was reflecting on all that's happening around the world and my deep distress, and I think everybody probably shares about the ruling or the lack of justice for Breonna Taylor and her family, which is hard to understand. He reminded me of these words, the words of Dr. King. If not us, who? And if not now, when? You are in for an extraordinary series of conversations today, so I want to get to it. You're either going to be watching the conversation that Bertis, our friend from R.E.M, is going to be having with Jeanine, Abrams, McLean, and Rebecca DeHart, a fair count. There's some good news that I can share with you, which is that just overnight, there was a judge ruling that the United States Census will continue. And the challenge here is, I'm not an expert at the courts. I'm sure some of you might be, but you know that that's an initial ruling. There'll probably be a fight moving up through the courts, but suffice to say, right now it looks like the United States Census will proceed through at least the end of October, which is good news because we don't want to leave anybody behind. That has to be who we are. We've talked to Travian about who do we aspire to be. And I think as a nation, a part of our values is that we leave no one behind, or at least that's who we aspire to be, and that's who we want to be. So that's some good news. So if you're watching that, some good news to take into that conversation. The conversation about equity, I have a feeling, is going to be a little bit tougher, but there are some deep lessons to learn from our friends in Atlanta, and we're going to get to that in just a quick minute. A little bit later today, you will have Susan Vandergriff, whose story is just extraordinary. She is a woman who lives in the southeastern part of Tennessee. I'm a Virginian by birth, and so I know that sits down in the corner of our state, that area where she works in. It's Chattanooga and Appalachia. And she has just done some extraordinary work, having some conversations that I actually was talking to my wife, and she's like, we're still talking about that now? Really? The work at Step Ahead Chattanooga won the Clarence B. Jones Impact Award. And they forged some conversations and built some bridges on some subjects around women's health that were considered taboo. So if you're interested, I highly recommend making some time for that now or at some point later if you're not able to be with us. And then we'll close out the day with Joy Harjo, who is the U.S. Poet Laureate. She is a citizen of the Creek Muskogee Nation. She's going to have a conversation with one of my favorite humans, Rebecca Arno, former network board chair. And I would like to, if you'll indulge me for one quick minute, to take us out with a piece from Joy. I opened this week with one of these, and I want to close this out. It's quick, so indulge me. I saw somebody on Twitter complaining, but you know what? Listen, take a breath. This is good for you. This poem by Joy is called Road. We stand first in our minds, and then we toddle from hand to furniture. Soon we are walking away from the house and lands of our ancestral creator gods to the circles of friends, of schooling, of work, making families and worlds of our own. We make our way through storm and sun. We walk side by side or against each other. The last road will be taken alone. There might be crowds calling for blood, or a curtained window by the leaving bed. It is best not to be afraid. Lift your attention. For the appearance of the next road, it might be through a family of trees, a desert, or rolling waves of sea. It's the ancient road the soul knows. We always remember it when we see it. It beckons at birth. It carries us home. With that, let's go.
Good morning. Welcome to ComNet's first and maybe only ever V Festival. It's good to be here with you today at the end of September. I will tell you right now, we're virtually recording this early in September. So roughly 3 weeks from now, projecting ahead, are some of the issues we're going to be talking about. And you'll see in just a minute why that last day of September is a really important one for the purposes of this conversation. I'm joined today in conversation by the two leaders of Fair Count, Jeanine Abrams and Rebecca DeHart. And I would like to ask y'all to tell us about Fair Count, its mission, its history, its origin story, and what you're doing in a hurry. So whoever wants to start, Jeanine or Rebecca.
You can go, Rebecca.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're so excited to be here on this conference virtually. And Bertis, we're really thrilled to be in conversation with you as well. All of us have such a great history with the state of Georgia and what we're doing with civic engagement, and your history with the culture of Georgia and how you combine those two is just fascinating. So we're really happy to be in conversation with old friends and also sharing our story with new friends today. I'm Rebecca DeHart, the CEO of Fair Count. Jeanine and I started Fair Count back in 2019. And Jeanine, I'll let you tell the story of how it came about, because I think it's pretty interesting. But we do work to ensure a fair and accurate count in the 2020 census in Georgia and around the nation. We are anchored in Georgia. Our work is in many states. We have organizers in many states, and we have probably done an effort in almost all of them now. But we really look at the census as the bedrock of democracy, this foundational piece, and we'll talk about this today about what's at stake if we don't have a fair and accurate census. But we also look at the census as a catalyst to bring people into civic engagement and to start building long-term organizing infrastructure between the census, redistricting, and voting, and keeping particularly historically marginalized communities at the center of this conversation so that we can really get more participation and have a more fair and equitable seat at the table. Jeanine, do you want to talk a little about how we started?
Definitely. And again, I just want to echo what Rebecca said. Bertis, it's great to be here talking to you and talking to all the folks that are viewing this. Fair Count was founded by Stacey Abrams, who is my second oldest sister. You may know who she is. And when she ran for governor of Georgia, after the election, she spent a lot of time thinking about what she could be doing to help the state of Georgia, even though she didn't have the title. And of course, one of the first things that came up was voter suppression. And so she started the organization Fair Fight. But as we were sitting and, talking and spending time together, she started talking about the census and why the census was so important. Because when she was a state legislator, her hands were tied to fight gerrymandering that was happening in the state because the census wasn't complete and she didn't have the data to back up and to challenge the maps that were being drawn. And so my background, I was formerly at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I'm a scientist. And so I've done population-based research for a long time. And so she asked me, hey, Jeanine, if you had to count everybody in Georgia, how would you do it? And I'm an amazing scientist. And so I was like, I don't know. I have no idea. I'll go do what I do best, do some research. So I did some research, came back with a few ideas. And she said, well, we need to start Fair Count, and brought on Rebecca to head this effort. And here we are a year and a half later doing In the Good Fight for Democracy.
So two follow-ups to that. she, you're talking about earlier in her career, I guess, just after the 2010 census, when she was pretty helpless, her hands were tied on being able to do anything about the maps because the census wasn't complete. What does that mean? What does it mean when a census isn't complete? And the second thing I want to do is just highlight, how did you know about Rebecca to bring her in as the policy person, the mechanics of government person? Tell us a little bit about Rebecca's background for those who don't know it.
Well, I'll start with the incomplete census. So in Georgia, we know that the census, the 2010 census only counted around 72% of Georgia households. And with a population the size of Georgia, you're talking about, that's a lot of people. Roughly 30% of folks weren't counted. And that, that undercount was seen across the nation, especially in groups. We know there are groups that the Census Bureau refers to as hard to count. We don't like that term because it implies that there's something inherently wrong with these populations, including populations of so racial and ethnic minorities, young children, the LGBTQ community, homeless persons, undocumented persons. We know that there's nothing inherently wrong with these groups, but that the systems that are in place to count them are inadequate. And so that's why we're doing the work that we're doing today. And we also know that in Georgia and across the country, white homeowners were overcounted, so counted more than once. And all those people plus more, or those groups that I just mentioned, were undercounted. And so that's something that we're trying to stave off this time around. But I will say, pivoting to the second part of this question, is Rebecca, and she can tell you more about her work. But Rebecca, when Stacey introduced me to Rebecca, the idea was, all right, Jeanine, you do the data, and then Rebecca knows the state. She's the former executive director of the Democratic Party of Georgia, and she led the coordinated campaign in 2018. And she's just a phenomenal political mind, even though we're not doing politics, but she just thinks about how all of these things are tied together and the ways that we can really engage people and mobilize people. And I'm talking like she's not here, so I'm going to let Rebecca. I'm going to let Rebecca tell a little bit more about her background.
Thank you. No, it's okay. Keep going now.
That was a good introduction.
I mean, it was a great introduction. I'm blushing on camera. Thank you so much for that. I've been lucky to know Stacey since she first ran for office back in State House, and I lived in her district. And back then I was working for other political organizations. I'm actually a social worker by trade, but for about 19 years now, I've been working in politics and public policy, macro side, and as well as electoral policy to try and see some long-term change get made. So I was ready to take a break from electoral politics. I was one of the longest serving executive directors of a state Democratic Party. And it was time for me to let that go and to move on someplace else. And so I was thrilled when Stacey asked if I would come and head this organization. It's by far the most fulfilling work I've been able to do to date. Jeanine and I are just two of now what is our 37 member team spread over, I think we have folks in 8 states now. And so we're really excited about what we were able to build. But Bertis, I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't also say in my history, both in a career as a person, but to say that I've also been a super huge R.E.M. fan for a long time. And I think everybody would love to know a little bit about your background too. Oh
yeah, I've been a pretty big R.E.M. fan for a long time too, including right now.
That's good.
But I did end up having a long opportunity to represent those guys. Sort of early days, lawyer right out of law school, learning the ropes, growing up with them, from literally being a fan and a friend and somebody who knew something about the music industry and was willing to learn more and kind of help them run their business for a long, long time, including now 9 years after they broke up. In fact, this is the month, 9 years ago, September, that they decided that they'd done it long enough, 30 years, great career, great body of work, something we're all proud of, the legacy. And they still are, in a lot of ways, they're close. And it was a very good decision for them as individuals and therefore as a group to not keep going. And so they still have, their songs really mean something to people. A lot of their stuff is still very timely. They're still very engaged as individuals. And it's been a real, it's been a great career for me. And it's kept me in a college town of Athens, Georgia, which has been a good thing which is not 365 days a year, which is fine too. I'm to turn it back just for a second. We'll keep talking. We got a while here, but I've learned something already today, which it doesn't surprise me when I heard Jeanine say that that roughly 30% of the population in Georgia wasn't counted last time. I don't exactly know how you got to that number, but I assume there are ways to find that out. That doesn't surprise me. That doesn't shock me at all. It's terrible. It disappoints me. It's sad. But it does surprise me people got counted twice, especially white homeowners got counted twice. How do they pull that off? And how did that somehow happen? And I guess the other thing tactically I would ask y'all is, what are you doing, or what can you do as an outside group, a nonpartisan C3 non-advocacy group in terms of partisan politics, but how do you as outsiders, not with any official role, keep them more honest, I guess would be a way of putting it, at least on their toes? Explain the dynamics of that. How did people get counted twice and others not counted at all? And what are you doing in 2020 as part of Fair Count to make sure that doesn't happen again?
So I can take the first part of that.
Sure.
And people may be able to hear my cat is in the background and he's super excited about this conversation. And he keeps meowing. So the way that people are overcounted is, say you have multiple homes and you count your family at all of those homes. You're only supposed to count yourself at the home that you spend the majority of your time in. But if you have vacation homes and you count your entire family, that's one way that in both homes, then you get double counted.
But does that mean that the person has to affirmatively commit fraud? Do they, like, if you have a home in North Georgia and you have a home in South Georgia, do you have to say, hey, count me both places, or does it just happen? Does it happen passively?
I don't think it's malicious. I just, I do think that that it happens, that people do, they're like, oh, let me do the census. Let me do it at all of these homes. But really the purpose of the census, and this is from the Census Bureau, is to count every person one time and in the right place, not one time in all the places that I frequent. So it's really getting that message to people that they shouldn't be counting themselves at multiple homes. Another way that people are overcounted are college students. So when, and this is becoming an issue in the middle of the pandemic, but college students are being counted or can be counted at the college and then at their parents' homes. And so that's another way that you get double counting. The Census Bureau does have mechanisms in place to deduplicate, but they're obviously not as effective as they should be. And that's one of the worries with the rush of the, and we can get into this a little bit later, but the census is being rushed to end a little bit early. And some of those checks and balances to deduplicate are being rushed through, or not even possibly not even being applied. And so there is the fear that there may be another massive overcount of certain groups. And then as far as what we're doing, go ahead, Rebecca. I was going to say,
if I could just jump on for just a second too about that. I mean, I think you just hit the nail on the head with it. We're not talking about nefarious that makes this overcount happen. But what we're really able to see in this scenario, I think, is put a microscope on what systematic inequities look like in practice. The census, it's this idea, if we just mail something to a household, they'll return it. Yes, they may have more than one household, or maybe they had just returned it before the second mailing hits their house. And they're like, oh, did they not get it the first time? I'll do it again. Or maybe the parents are split and both parents answer for their kids, or their kids are at college. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why there's the deduplication that can take place. But that whole premise is based on the fact that somehow in America, families are stagnant homeowners who can receive mail over time and correspond with the government. And that's sort of problem number one, because a large majority people in America don't communicate that way. They're renters. They live in weekly hotels. They are experiencing homelessness. They are very moving place to place. There's a large segment of America, roughly 5%, that don't even get the mail through the USPS, and the Census Bureau never even mails them the form. So that is how we start to see these inequities, because we have a system that's set up to capture information one way, but it's not the way that the majority of America can share information. And that's where Fair Count really kind of steps in to try and, help and almost bring like the stepping stool to the communities, that aren't able to be communicated with in the way that the government is doing it, not because there's anything wrong with them, but because the government hasn't created a more sophisticated method to do so. Now, this year, the census was online for the first time, majoritively. There was pockets of it that were in 2010, but, they really pushed online. And for a large number of people, it was great. People went online, they got done with their census. But again, it was really great if you have, like I have, Apple Fiber or whatever, and my internet's super fast, or if you have broadband or you have whatever, or you have an unlimited data plan where you're, it's comfortable for you to go on your phone, surf the internet. I'll take this survey really quickly. There's a large number of Americans who, do not have broadband internet into their counties yet because it's very rural, or maybe they don't have an unlimited data plan and have to be very careful with what they use that phone for. Maybe dial-up is still going on and it doesn't work well in that. So there's still just a large portion of people in America that sometimes get left out of the equation. And that's where is really interested. We're interested in these communities because they haven't just been historically marginalized in the census for decade after decade, but they tend to be the same communities who are more often than not likely to experience voter suppression, have more polling precincts closed down, have their views, needs, communities sliced and diced in the operation of redistricting, making sure that they don't have a voice in who it is that's representing them, all the way from local school board up into Congress. And so there's an idea that if we can build more resources, if we can build more infrastructure in with the communities that have been left out of the story of America for so long, we'll have a better, more vibrant America with a democracy that is actually responsive to all instead of just some.
Yep.
That helps me understand it. And you're filling the gap between people in communities that have historically been just passed over. Maybe it's not on purpose. Maybe it's sort of kind of not a priority, but y'all are out there on the street level with the technology and with the know-how to make sure people get counted. And I also, the other thing I learned earlier today when we were just talking before the call briefly, which is I did not realize you were doing some voter registration as well. Again, on a nonpartisan basis, you're not working for a party anymore. You're not on behalf of any particular candidate, but y'all are using this work. So that is some of the dovetail y'all have, I guess, with Fair Fight, your non-associated, but somehow at least historically related organization. It's kind of one of those things where it's two groups that I think 2 years ago didn't exist, right? Or maybe Fair Fight did exist 2 years ago, but Fair Count is those are both brand new, and yet they're now kind of ubiquitous. Everybody knows what Fair Fight does, what Fair Count does, the differences. But in this case, y'all do have some crossover in terms of getting people not only in the being counted for the census process, but in the voting process or the voter engagement process.
A little bit. We actually don't really engage much with registration. There's a lot of laws in Georgia that govern registration, and there's a long history of secretaries of state and others throwing advocates in jail for trying to help people to register to vote or to vote. And so that is not something that we navigate at this time because we're so wholly focused on the census, which takes us to that September 30th deadline you were talking about, Bertis. But there's a great organization in Georgia called the New Georgia Project that has been registering hundreds of thousands of people a year. And so we're really excited about that. Fair Fight is also a C4 organization. And for folks in the audience that are familiar with it, a C4 is a little bit more of a partisan organization. They have, they also have a PAC. We can't coordinate with them at all on election, and we don't. We're a nonprofit C3 organization, but we do voter education work. And that is so important. If voting were easy in Georgia, we wouldn't make the headlines and the talk show circuits every time we had an election. There are so many disparities, nefarious efforts, ineptitudes that happen. And we feel really strongly about helping to take up that space on the C3 nonprofit side and help with, GOTV mobilization efforts, but also education efforts.
And I'll just, to tie everything together, going back to the origin story, and, Stacey's hands being tied during the redistricting process, we consider the census, voting, and redistricting as the 3 pillars of democracy. And that if we want democracy to live, because we know that it's in danger, if we want it to thrive in the future, that we have to make sure that we cover all 3 of these aspects. The census, the decennial census, and there, just so people know, there is an annual census that's done. It's called the American Community Survey, and it only targets a few million households in the United States. But it's done every year, and you might have heard it as the long form. But when you think about the decennial census, which is the basis even for the American Community Survey, it only happens once every 10 years. And even though there are 3 pillars, if the census is faulty or falters, and if it's trash, we can't use those data. And that impacts our ability, our power when we our ability to redraw redistricting lines, which distributes power, and the power of our vote. And so while they're all pillars and important, the census is the bedrock also, because if we don't get it right, then everything else over the next decade is going to be impacted in a negative way.
Yeah. And that's so true with resources too. I mean, Bertis, you're a public school advocate out there fighting all the time for education. All 3 of us are parents. All 3 of us, have experience with the public school, although the public school happens on this desk right behind me right now for 1st grade. Yeah. But, the census, our school systems are reliant on the census. When communities don't answer the census, that's how you get overcrowded classrooms, because they don't count for enough and they draw the school boundaries different. Free and reduced lunch, Head Start programs, a variety of programs that go through our public schools. And so when you have communities, historically undercounted communities that don't answer the census, then their schools suffer, their hospitals suffer, their roads suffer, which is why the town just on the other side, that has a much higher census performance, their hospitals are more equipped, their schools are better, the roads they drive on can handle the thrust of their community. It's really astounding that there's basically not anything in American life, democracy, and infrastructure that the census does not touch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just part of the overall puzzle. And as you say, it's a really critical piece. If you don't start from the right data, if you don't have the right count, then clearly needs are going to go unmet. You give a great example with the overcrowded classrooms or the roads. So speaking of the September 30th deadline, we've alluded to it a couple times, the end of the 3rd quarter. That does seem a little early for an annual census. I know that that's been a recent change administratively, like in the last few months, I guess. But tell us about what is the plan for fair count before, in the next 5 days after this conversation airs, from up till the 30th of September, and what is your post-September 30th plan? Do y'all that's it? We've done what we can do, we go home now? Or I assume that there's a post-September 30th phase of your work, and what's unfolding? What are the mechanics of how what you do is interacting with the actual census and the count we're going to get? Whoever wants to take that one.
I can start.
Okay.
So actually the census was scheduled to end on July 31st. Everything's been crazy, but we had a pandemic, and because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Census Bureau and the administration said, hey, let's delay this until October 31st. There's no way we can get the numbers, and the analyses done before October 31st. So that was the plan. And organizations other advocacy organizations that are working on the census, they were trying to figure out how to scramble to get things done past July 31st. And, we were making plans and made plans going until July 31st. And then on August 3rd, the Census Bureau did a complete 180. And they said, even though they've been saying for months that they didn't have enough time, they then said on August 3rd, actually, we're going to go ahead and we're going to finish the census with one of the highest or lowest response rates going into, it's called the non-response follow-up period, or NRFU. And that's where the door knockers start. So they had the lowest self-response rates before the door knocking phase started. There were issues with hiring and still continue to be issues with hiring. And they said, actually, we're just going to get it done a month early, which would be the shortest NRFU period in modern history, and in the middle of a pandemic that is not waning. And so it's been a shock for people, shock for groups that, like us, that we're like, how in the heck do you plan on counting everyone? And we're getting news now that, the problems aren't going away. They're continuing to build. I won't get into all of that, but we're in a fight right now to make sure that communities don't get that communities are accurately counted. And the last, I'll throw a little bit of data at you. At the end of July, when we go back to communities that are historically undercounted, we know that Black, Native American, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, and Asian, predominantly communities that were predominantly made up of those racial and ethnic groups, were trailing over 10% behind in response rates than predominantly white communities. And this door knocking phase has historically been critical to get out the count in those hard to count communities. And so with the government and with the Census Bureau and the administration saying, well, let's just cut it short by 30 days, you are basically, sentencing everybody to a bad census. And so what we're trying to do in other groups across the country, we're trying to mitigate all of this by just, I almost said something inappropriate, but we're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, and everything at the census. And that's what we'll be doing. And we're also fighting to try and get the administration to roll this back, to extend the deadline until October 31st. And so hopefully when this airs, we will have, the update will be that the census has been extended until October 31st, but we're working under the assumption that we have to end on September.
What would it take for it to be extended? Would it take an act of Congress? Would it take the head of the Census Bureau or the administration? What are the mechanics of extending it?
Yeah, it's an act of Congress. And it's interesting that you say that, because this, head of the Census Bureau is like, oh, sure, we can get it done by September 30th. And we should have real talk about why they want to get it done so fast too. But, Census Bureau, heads of Census Bureau Commerce Departments past have pretty much all come out and said, absolutely not. The American Statistical Society has come out and said this is basically a travesty. The nerd side of policy and government going on in America right now is just absolutely, losing our minds about this, because it is so consequential and it is being treated so cavalierly. So I think the big thing is, and we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, but the truth of the matter is that politics exist in Washington and people are cutting deals all the time. The process of apportionment is a very choreographed process that happens at the end of every decennial census. So they were supposed to end in July. They were supposed to have 5 or 6 months to get all the data together. Around December 31st of every year, the Census Bureau comes out and announces both to the President of the United States and to the people who live in America, this is our final count of how many people live in this nation. And because of this count, we believe each state should get these numbers of congressional seats. The president then takes possession of that data, reviews it, and then transmits it to Congress, where Congress gives it to the states for redistricting. The president has made very clear, the sitting president, that he wants to be able to take possession of that data because he will cull from that data whomever he thinks is an undocumented person. And that is why that executive order happened again in August, saying that we should not count undocumented persons. We are setting ourselves up for a constitutional crisis. There are lawsuits all over the places. There are injunctions, that have been filed. There are cases that are being streamlined to the United States Supreme Court right now. But make no mistake, if the census were to go to the recommended deadline of October 31st, then this sitting president would not get his hands on that apportionment data unless he gets reelected in November. In this scenario, no matter who is elected in November, the current sitting president will be able to take possession of this apportionment data. So we can see how the census is sort of the beginning of a cascading effect of dominoes falling all over each other. And I mean, don't even get us started about what's going to happen with citizen voting age population data and redistricting. But we're really sort of right now facing an inflection point where folks want to overhaul the way our democracy works, who it stands for, and who it represents for the rest of time. And we're at the point right now where we're dealing with the mechanisms that will allow that and whether or not they go through. We don't sleep well, Bertis.
Can you give us at a time when it certainly fits into the theme of like, who do you trust? I mean, is it better to mail your ballot? Is it better to go out and brave the elements and wear a mask and vote in person? Is it better to vote early?
Ooh, yeah.
There's already this failure of institutions or failure of people's trust in institutions. The post office being a great example of that. I assume the post office situation is impacting the census as well. If it's impacting voting and regular mail and package delivery, I assume it's impacting the census too. Are there any silver linings here? Is there something? I don't think we're supposed to bring everybody down the entire hour. I assume there must be something we can do, something we as citizens can do, other than what we generally do, which is keep up and stay engaged and try to study the issues. And give us some good news in the middle of all this. Maybe I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but I see why you don't sleep well at night when you just described that. It's pretty daunting, pretty overwhelming. To say the least.
Have some. Yeah, I think so. And I think to answer the question you asked before, which we didn't answer, which is where is fair count going? Because we're at an inflection point in this nation on a variety of fronts, right? There's these last 6 months have just been, huge. It will be for generations, and the repercussions that will come out of everything. Fair count is really looking at what we can do to be part of long-term change. And that is what gets me some sleep at night so that I can get up knowing that we have a plan going forward. And this airs on September 24th. Jeanine's right. Hopefully the census will go to October 31st. I don't know if that's really going to happen. So we'll have 5 days to try and get it done. If anyone watching this has not gotten it done, they need to go to my2020census.gov and get it done today. And they should share that with everyone they know. We'll follow up. We'll do all of the good stuff. We're going to give our staff 1 day off on Friday, October 2nd, and they're coming back to do GOTV and getting out the count and getting out the vote with the same communities that have been historically left behind in the census. These are communities that have higher rates of not being registered to vote, don't get the resources put in by, civic and electoral infrastructure in order to create the mobilization and the education, things that are needed to get people energized and part of the process. We're going to be working with those communities and really hoping to energize and get more people to participate in the election and to be able to tie what an election looks like to their lives and why the vote is such an important franchise, and then not miss a beat and start to think about redistricting in new ways. That this isn't where politicians draw districts so that they can figure out how to keep working, but how do we make the people front and center, where they're able to choose districts based on communities of need, based on, unity and things that bring folks together, so that when they have representation, they're actually speaking in the voices of the people that they see and hear. And then we're going to continue on with Census and American community survey work too. So we see this space to bring all aspects of that civic engagement together. And we know that there's a lot of work. What are the things that make us really happy? Doing this work has so many positive residual effects. One of my favorite stories, when we started Fair Count, we realized that how could people fill out their census online when they didn't have access to the internet? So we started creating internet installations all over Georgia. We didn't create them in new places and make people come to us. We talked about to the barbershops where people hung out on Friday nights. We talked to, the community centers, to the daycare providers, to the Boys and Girls Clubs. Where are places that people feel safe and comfortable going? Where can we provide? We would, we bought a bunch of iPads, Chromebooks, hotspots, and we paid for the internet to continue in that community through December 31st. One of the best things about these has been, one, of course, people have been doing their census, but we've also been learning people have been registering to vote. People have been using the internet in their community to create vote by mail or to ask for vote by mail ballots so they didn't have to wait in line in a pandemic. We've held days of actions and job fairs where people who have been suffering from unemployment have been able to go out and help get jobs. And when the pandemic struck, we learned that particularly in South and Middle Georgia, where rural areas were really getting hit by COVID before anybody really had their arms around it, that it was because of these devices that, communities of faith were able to go online over Facebook, and it was keeping communities from getting together in that very dangerous time. We had one story of a pastor who said 40 families would pull up in front of his church every week so their kids could log in and do their homework. These are resources not just to be extractive to get people to do the census. When we look at communities that have been left behind in the census, they have been cut out or have had the franchise stolen from them in a variety of other aspects too. And so building resources and building power and hiring from within those communities and doing that sort of long-term deep dive organizing is showing ripple effects in so many other aspects of life. It's really, it's powerful and humbling.
Wow. That is I would put that in the category of some encouraging news. Jeanine, do you want to add, or I can ask another question?
The only thing I would say is, I'm a scientist. I was very, even though my sister was a politician, I was very not into, I paid attention, but I wasn't engaged as much as I am today. And that's what I see in other people, in that you talk to people that the census isn't sexy, guys. It's not, something that people want to talk about every day. But when you are, when you see folks that didn't know the impact that this had on their entire lives. I was in New Orleans doing a workshop, and there was I think he was a 54-year-old Black man who came to one of our Black Men Count. That's one of our initiatives, national initiatives. And after the presentation, he stood up and he said that he had never been counted in the census. He said he didn't think his parents counted him when he was in his 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. He didn't count himself because he assumed other people were counting him. And he was like, he just didn't know that his entire life had been impacted, and he was ready to go and get to work. And that's something that, whenever I wake up and I'm feeling down, I think about the people who the light bulb came on. And it's not just for the census. And that's what we really try to do, is tie all of this together. It's not just for the census. It's about voting. It's about being involved in the redistricting process. It's about being civically engaged. And, that's the stuff that makes me happy, is that I can see that light bulb go off in people's brains. And so, yeah, that's my happy moment.
That's neat. Well, it's happened with me just in getting to talk to y'all as we set this thing up, and then again today, because, everybody's got so much information barraging at them every day. And how do you get their attention? And how do you take something that's really interesting to nerds and people really into politics and kind of inside baseball stuff, and how do you get it to the point where it becomes an action item for people? People really care. I want to focus something else back a little bit on Georgia. I know y'all are nationally oriented. You have different states where you have offices, but I know your origins in Georgia, and you're certainly still focused on Georgia, and we're holding the conference virtually in Georgia. And that is redistricting, which is, you mentioned that about the possession of the data, the ability to excise, use the red pencil or whatever to get rid of the undocumented, which will be very, very legally dubious and likely not going to work. But at least it sets a narrative. At least it sets a bar to have to overcome, and another set of roadblocks. And People have to go to court for all that, and there's always uncertainty with that. But how does that affect the state level? You're talking about at the national level, if it's September 30th versus October 31st, and when the data gets transmitted, and then depending on who won, who's going to be inaugurated, presumably on January 20th. What are the mechanics at the state level? Because I could see a situation not unlike last year where one of the parties picks up a lot of seats, and if that happens again, then at least as of the beginning of January, that party would be more in control, the way it's always worked at the state level. Whichever party's in control controls redistricting, which Stacey was frustrated about early in her career in the state house. How would it work this year in terms of if the census isn't finished, if the data is incomplete, depending on how the election swings in terms of which house is in control? Would there still be essentially a lame duck party in power that a couple of weeks from now isn't going to be any power more? They could actually do some things. Is that something y'all are playing out, the various scenarios for that in our state of Georgia?
Yeah, do you want me to start, Jeanine? So yes, to so many. The thing we're worried about the most, and which is happening, is something called, we all call it CVAP data. But a few years back, there was a case in Texas that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. It's called Evanwell. And what that was is it was actually a woman who was an officer of the state Republican Party in Texas who filed suit and basically said, it doesn't seem fair that my representation, also, my state senators, state house and everything, that these districts are made up of people who can't vote. They should only be made up of people who vote. And that's always been sort of like the history of America. We try and get a sense of how many people in the areas. We count people as whole persons. The 14th Amendment guaranteed that. And she wanted to challenge that for a couple of reasons. One being that there was this guy Hoffeller, which if any of you need like a night down a Wikipedia rabbit hole, like a John Grisham novel, take a look at what happened with Thomas Hoffeller, who did all of the research and found out that if we excluded certain people from redistricting, that we would guarantee a more Republican, white, non-Hispanic majority in state legislatures for generations. And then he died.
Was he the North Carolina? Was he the North Carolina?
Yeah, I don't know if he was there.
His daughter.
His daughter found out his jump drives and gave him to the news. Yeah, fascinating stuff. But so anyhow, so this case went up to the Supreme Court. It's called Evanwell, and Evanwell basically said, no, in Congress you have to count whole people, but not totally sure about state legislatures, and they left the door open. And since then, there's been a lot of interest in sort of special interests who are trying to get states to move towards citizen voting age population, which means that you have to be somebody who is illegally able to vote and of 18 years or older in order to be counted in redistricting, which would cut out children from the story of America, undocumented folks, people who are on visas, etc. It would dynamically change the makeup primarily of areas where folks like that are more in numbers. So cities and metropolitan areas and everything, all of a sudden districts are going to have to grow to expand in ways that they had not had to before. Georgia, Bertis, is going to be ground zero for this. Our state constitution is one of the only ones in the nation that does not say that we count all people. It just says that we use decennial census information. So they could go in the dead of the night when they do their conference committee reports and totally switch it to CVAP without anyone even knowing, without ever having a public conversation about it. Texas is in the same boat. They're going to try and do it in Missouri up on the ballot this year in 2020. And we're watching that really closely because it's not about immigration. It's not about who's documented, who's not. It's about getting an idea of who lives in a certain area and what those needs are. You know, if 50% of the people there are children and undocumented and they're not counted, then how are we making decisions when a hurricane comes through and we have to come up with an evacuation plan and we only know that there's 50% of the people that are there? People are going to die. You know, I mean, how do we fund schools, hospitals, et cetera? But that's the road we're going down. And that is the road where Fair Count is going to fight harder than we ever have before.
So you're not giving them any ideas, I'm sure. I'm sure that it's just something they're actually conceivably, this is something that would happen post November 3rd, but
Yes.
pre-inauguration of the new state house. And
Yeah.
so obviously they wouldn't do it in advance. They would only do it once they were lame ducks. Wow, that's pretty chilling stuff. Doesn't seem like the U.S., United States, or what we've thought of as democracy. Wow.
It would dramatically overhaul democracy and who we think matters and counts and how we move forward. And I think, we'll see. I would not be surprised if some states are successful in it. There are a bunch of legislative advocacy organizations that this is their number one thing, is to get states ready to do this for partisan gain now, but to the detriment of democracy and everyone later.
Wow, that's pretty sobering. That's an angle of this. I've learned a lot this whole conversation, but that's definitely one I had not realized. I assumed there may be something like that up, but just to hear it explained the way that could happen, and the fact that the Supreme Court has left that door open, that's pretty chilling. So what else? What else do y'all want to tell us about the census, about the upcoming week before the census closes, unless there's been some miraculous breakthrough to where it's been extended till October 31st? Anything else for the good of the order? Or questions for me, or what do you? I think we have a few minutes. We're supposed to wrap up.
I do feel like, Bertis, one thing that I love talking to you about, and I think is so important, and we're seeing this play out not just in civic engagement, but in all the issues everywhere, that we're working on, is this intersection of art and politics and civic engagement and statement making. And we've seen so much this summer that has been, whether it's Black Lives Matter on a street, or, new murals that go up, or songs that are written. Maybe we should all be singing "It's the End of the World as We Know It." We feel fine, but
a lot of people are.
How do you sort of reconcile, and how do you think art can maybe help see us through this?
I guess looking back in history, certainly artists are kind of at the forefront of where people are. They just have a way of expressing things, maybe ahead of their time, maybe somewhat prophetically. Certainly, if it's good art and it gets through and it gets popular, then obviously it's something people pay attention to, people care about, people identify with. That's their band or their artist or their book. It's a way, I think. I can't. It's one of those things that's hard to explain. It's just a fact that over time, artists have often cultural change has often presaged political change and been part of these movements. And that's my best explanation for it. I'm sure there are people who've written really good PhD dissertations and books about all that. But just the era of music I've been associated with music and rock music in particular, but certainly these days with all the various genres of music, the types of artists out there, they have a voice, they have a platform, they have followers and on social media, and they can help point people in the right direction. People are overwhelmed, people are feeling lack of trust. They become kind of their own institutions and have their own credibility, and people really care about what they think. So it's a powerful medium.
Yeah. Jeanine, you've been doing a lot of work with Black Theater United too, haven't you?
Yeah. So my fun fact about me is that in addition to biology, I also minored in theater when I was in college. And so I really, in the theater courses that I took, some of the courses were about, it was called the Art of Transformation. And there was a lot of work on, how do we use theater to advance, some of these, political or civic engagement, or just like what is going on in the world? Like, how do we use art to address these issues? And I think that, what you were saying, like when you have the creativity, I think a lot of times people think about, when you think about, civic engagement and politics, you think about, like, how do we, strategy and data and all of these things, but how do you tie all that together with creative outlets, whether that be through music, through theater, through writing. You know, like, how do we communicate these messages to people in ways that they will pay attention and listen and then engage? And so, just like you said, I think that there are a lot of creative minds out there. Rebecca mentioned that we have been working with Black Theater United. So Broadway has been shut down because of the pandemic. And so this organization was founded, you know, in the midst of all of this, because they were like, we have to do something. And, you know, one of the collaborations that we did was with Billy Porter and Misty Copeland. And so Audra McDonald, who's one of the founding members, got all this organized, and we had a There's Only One Me campaign where Billy Porter got out there and talked about being, you know, how he was unique and why people needed to be counted. And there's tap dancing going on and music playing in the background. Then you have Misty Copeland on another one that, you know, really spoke to me because I didn't know we were the same age. She's like, you know, they're Black woman born in 1982. And I was like, that's me. And then she's like, but there's only one me, you know, there's only one, you know, I'm an athlete, I'm this. And, you know, and she's dancing and twirling. And it's just something that I think people, you know, and we didn't do message testing on this, but I think it has just been so powerful that people would, you know, and you know, people looking at themselves and being like, yeah, there's millions of Black women that are born in 1982, but there's only one Jeanine that, you know, is a scientist and loves theater and wishes in another dimension she's a Broadway star. Like, those are the kind of things that, you know, I think really reach people. And you can't get that through strategy. You can't get that through analyzing data. You can only get that through creativity. And that's where I think art of all forms is just is needed and impactful.
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't even know about that, but I can see every Misty Copeland, Billy Porter fan in the world knows about what you just. Yeah, I know who they are. I'm aware of them, but I'm not on their list. I'm not seeing their feed. And but I think that's it's very impactful when artists speak from their hearts like that. And you're right. It's not the kind of thing that can be message tested and let's get this, you know, let's hit the right marks. I mean, it just has to flow. And I feel like in this world of everything flowing, all these different niches, that the arts can be a really powerful mobilization tool. It really can be something that helps turn public opinion. Well, with under a week to go till evidently the putative end of the census counting, this has been really inspirational for me to get to talk to the two of you and see what you're doing, and to hear more about the way Fair Count is approaching this. And it sounds like you will be busy after, you said you're going to be busy after the 2nd, which you'll take that day off. You'll be back at work, and plenty of work to do moving forward. Any final thoughts about any of this? It's been, I've really enjoyed getting to talk to y'all, and look forward to hearing, you know, as the month unfolds, and then as the fall unfolds, democracy in action. Jeanine, yeah. Rebecca?
I would say thank you. This has been thank you for taking time to talk to us. This has been I really enjoyed this conversation. The one thing I would say, 5 days out, right? So this is where everybody that's watching this comes into play. We've had text banks and all kinds of things going up into to this date. But in the next 5 days, you can do your own outreach. You can get on social media and share. We have 5 days until the census ends. You can text everybody in your phone about this. If you're driving around town, you can go get something and, you know, the little car marker stuff and write on there, don't forget to take your census. There are things that people can do, and we really need to we had an event with another artist. It was with Audra McDonald and Felicia Rashad. And one of the things Felicia Rashad said was, we have to also get outside of our, you know, not necessarily our bubbles, but people have different life trajectories. People have different stories and histories. We have to get outside of our comfort zone and talk to people that we might not normally talk to. And and encourage them to tell other people. And I'll just say this one story. I was driving, or we were getting ready to go somewhere, and I had a flat tire. My husband was putting air in the car, in my tire. And this really, like, you know, this car pulled up with, you know, these two guys in it, and they were, you know, he was putting in the air in the tire, and I had a fair count sign on the side had the magnet on the side of my car. And so one of the guys says, he's like, "Hey, what's fair count?" You know? And my husband says, "Oh, you know, we don't know these dudes. Like, they just pulled up beside us." And he's like, "Oh, this is a nonprofit to make sure that everybody's counted in the census. Have you been counted in the census?" And the guys were like, "Yeah, we did it already." And, you know, and then so he said, "All right, then you need to go and tell other people to be counted." And it's that kind of thing. You know, you have to, we all have a role to play in this, and you don't have to be a part of Fair Count. But if you can just tell everybody you see that they need to get counted in the census, I think it'll make a massive difference around.
And those practical types of personal sharing, which are very powerful in groups of people, they can go to your website. They can go to the Fair Count website to see a checklist, to see, you know, samples of what they could do. I mean, there's this toolkit there that you can go and put into practice yourself. That's great. Good.
Yep. And the only thing I would add too, I've had so much fun talking to both of you today. We didn't really talk about how the first step towards our recovery from this pandemic is really the census. And I just want to stress that, because when we do get on the other side of this, we're going to need to make sure we get to send our kids back to schools that are funded, and that, you know, hospitals are not going to be on the brink of closing. We just lost 2 hospitals in Georgia in the past month, 2 rural hospitals. You know, we're going to have to make sure that there's an economy ready, that people are ready for jobs. And the way that we do that is to get counted by the census. There's actually no easier way to start our road to recovery from COVID than to go ahead and get counted in the census, to make sure that all those resources will come down to our communities. They're very, very dependent on one another. But we thank y'all so much. Bertis, we thank you so much for facilitating this, and to Sean and Tristan and our good friends at the Communications Network. This has just been such a delight to be able to participate in this conversation. Please visit us at faircount.org, you know, to keep abreast. And if there's anything you want to do for the last 5 days, please go to my2020census.gov and do your census. 10 minutes, totally safe. Gives you all the power in the world. All the resources and the political power that democracy is able to give to one person at a time happens during that 10 minutes. So please make sure that you and everybody are counted. Well
said. I've never thought this much about the census, but I think these days we all have to. We need to. So thanks for informing us, educating us, and thanks for all the work you're doing to make sure we get a fair count. Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of the conference. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.